Thank you very much, Benjamin, for the brief introduction. I think it's great to see this turnout here today, that there's interest. I think there's interest in the IoT topic. There's also a lot of interest in open source in general. And I think we've already seen the huge amount of work that the Eclipse Foundation is putting into this Eclipse IoT working group. I think we've seen exciting progress also on the MQTT side from Ian, and there's more to come this afternoon. I think some more exciting projects also on the fog side, but also on how to tie end-to-end all of these aspects of the IoT together. So what I want to highlight in the next about 40 minutes or so is how we at Bosch, as a huge company, and this is actually the monster that I'll be talking about, are coping, how we're how we have embarked on this journey to IoT, and how we have embraced open source, and how we're dealing with that, and how we see the benefit of this. And I'll also have a few words specifically why we are also working with the Eclipse Foundation in these topics. So when talking about, I was thinking about, is it going to be the big elephant in the room, or is it going to be the big monster? Just to give you a little bit an idea of Bosch, the company might be known to most of you. Different products, whether it's some people know our windshield wipers. When I joined Bosch, a friend of mine here in Singapore was joking, so are you going to be embarking on the Internet of Spark Plugs in any ways? So that's still our biggest business there, but we also have other domains. When I'm typically interviewing candidates who want to join our company, I ask them, how do you know Bosch? For many of them, it's the consumer goods, whether it's the vacuum cleaners or the white goods in the building. So it's a very broad spectrum of topics that we're addressing. Also with more than 400,000 associates worldwide, I think one of the bigger companies out there, and also pretty big revenue. Now looking into, I think what's more interesting for the people here in the room is also when we're looking at R&D. How many people do we have working in R&D? This is still 64,000 people and 125 locations worldwide. Now, not all of these are working in software, as we are traditionally a hardware vendor. So software is not our main business. This is where we typically work with partners. We do a little bit ourselves as well. But we are really coming, when we're looking at the Internet of Things, we would say we would declare ourselves as a things company and not as an internet company. I think that's very important to understand. Nevertheless, there's a few things that I think we have understood about the Internet of Things that our CEO has understood 10 years ago, how important the Internet of Things will be for the future of the company. Now, specifically in this huge gamut of a company, the little corner where I'm coming from, and also that Early is coming from, he'll be presenting later on Eclipse Vorto, the language to tie everything in the IoT together. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of Bosch called Bosch Software Innovations. And we have been working on the Internet of Things for the past 10 years. So 10 years ago, Bosch decided we need to invest in software in various domains. We've had lots of engineers who are experts in embedded software coming from automotive electronics, and then obviously also other smart products. But the fact that we now have a whole subsidiary solely focusing on cloud-based software, on back-end software, is something new. And we also realize, when we're talking about IBM, for example, we will never be an IBM, we'll never be a Google, we'll never be an AWS. However, we need to tie, or we need to build those bridges in those worlds, and we also have a strategic interest in having, let's say, a pillar or the bridgehead into this world as well. So this is where our IoT platform comes in, and this is also where, in our context, Eclipse IoT comes in, where open source software comes in. Yeah. So we are also based here in Singapore, but obviously our headquarters in Europe, and also offices in China, Japan, and the US. And I think what you see here is also on the top, when we're looking at the verticals, because I'll come back to that a little bit later. We're really looking into any domain that you would envision. So for us, it's also important to have the technology to support all of these domains. I think we've heard from Ian's presentation also, MQTT, there was an initial use case, very specific use case, very specific domain. However, MQTT has moved on, has made great inroads also in other domains, and hence also there are new requirements which have come up which need to be addressed. So where do we get the software from when we want to provide services that go beyond the hardware, which go beyond the physical topics? Just looking a little bit around what is out there in terms of open source software, what is happening out there in the world. And I think many of you are also familiar with the fact that, or might also be using lots of open source projects. And we see, looking at GitHub, I think it's not the only one that's important to know, but it's, I think, the leading open source hoster. And we see the increase on active projects, on active users, of what all the projects which are happening out there. So we can really see that open source, I think the concept has been around for since we can think of computing, actually. However, we have more and more, while the proprietary software has taken on a fair share until about a decade ago, we now have the open source gaining more and more grounds in here. And it's becoming more and more important also for companies to base their business and to invest in open source software. So how does it work for companies? So this is a bit of our view, and I think we've seen this also with other companies, how we can embrace open source software, what can we do and how can we benefit from the open source software. I think top left, one of the things that we see is that a lot, when we want to build systems specifically around the IoT, these are very complex systems usually. Even though one can think, yeah, there's a device, maybe there's a gateway, we send the data to the cloud. To make this all work, and also to make this work for millions or even billions of devices, the complexity becomes immense. And however, there's a lot of that complexity that would be counted these days to infrastructure, to commodity, things that everybody needs to do. And this is one of the things, or a key topic for us is to say, whenever there's something that's commodity, where we see this is not differentiating in the market, it actually makes sense to work together with other companies. The reason being, I think investment is one, but there's also more pragmatic reasons, like quality of code. The more people who are using a project, and I think Ian also can relate to that, the more users you have, the more feedback you get, the more issues are reported, the higher the quality of your product. And if we're just building our proprietary software, and we're the only users, or only our customers are using this, we have much less feedback than if there's a whole ecosystem and there's various people using that software. And we do not have a disadvantage from in the market, because if for the pieces that we are using open source software are commodity. And I think it's also relating to this topic of commodity software. What's commodity tomorrow is not commodity today. So I think this is also something we see the world evolving, and we see maybe something when we're looking at MQT, for example, again 15 years ago, that might have made sense to keep that as proprietary technology, while the standard was not proprietary, but maybe the technology. But today, I think it's so widely available, it's so well known, that it's not a competitive item anymore. So recognizing that something is transforming from differentiated to commodities is also important. I've mentioned briefly the topic of quality invest. I think the shared development, this is also what we're seeing through organizations like the Eclipse Foundation that give a solid framework to work together, well governed, and where all of the involved parties can benefit. And then obviously, if we can then bring all these pieces together, we have the highest benefit. So at the end of the day, I think also for when it comes to open source software and basing your products on open source software, it also gives you a competitive advantage actually. We see this in the IoT platforms. If you're working with the IoT platforms of the various vendors, you will always have a vendor lock-in, right? And if you are using open source software for your platform for some of the critical parts, you can minimize your dependency on your suppliers, and you can. It's also possible to create actually a larger ecosystem across multiple companies. I've mentioned the topic of invest. I think if what's important here, if you are working on a project, it's your proprietary development right now, and you want to open source that project. I mean, there's a few pitfalls involved, but it also means, and you can see this here, it means an investment, because there's a number of aspects that need to be respected to open source software, particularly when it comes to IP aspects. You need to make sure that you actually own all the IP that's in the product. You need to understand where it comes from. You need to go through all the relevant checks. And this is also where we see a lot of benefits from the Eclipse Foundation, for example, because they have a thorough process also in place to incubate new projects, to open source projects. However, it means an invest. It means spending an effort to open source the project. However, you'll get payback on this. As soon as other partners on board, as they start contributing to the project, your effort will reduce, your quality will increase, and the adoption will also increase. And if we're looking at the companies, how they are embracing open source software, so this is not just hypothetical, but when we're looking at the leading contributors, for example, on GitHub, how many? So these are the number of employees of the respective companies who are contributing to projects on GitHub. So you really see that there's a lot happening, and that companies are playing a key role in this ecosystem. So how can you do this as a company? It's not straightforward. It's a little bit more complex than simply publishing software on a GitHub repository. As I mentioned, there's very simple things, sometimes like copying a code snippet from a code forum, including that in your code, and publishing then again. You might be infringing on somebody's IP rights. So these are the type of things you want to be aware of. So there's a number of topics to respect. I think one of the shifts that you have to do in your company to enable the contributions to open source is you're actually moving away from simply make or buy, but to a third model that is collaboration. Collaboration with other companies, opening up the way you work and how you actually make the it's really a shift of mindset that needs to be happening in your company from this purely developing for yourself, only for your customer, and it's all for money. But you really need to understand how you can create more together with your partners. So your strategy in your company needs to evolve. You need to look further. It's not just a product strategy, but there's also one element in that strategy which becomes the open source strategy. So which parts of your code, coming back to this commoditization also potentially, which parts of your code do you open source at which point in time, which partners can you work with? That might also be something worth checking before you open source something. And also at which point in time do you do that? The second topic, once you've decided that you actually do want to contribute to the open source world, you will need an open source management. So this is something where we have established with our legal team and open source experts together mechanisms and processes in order to also educate our developers, to make them understand what the legal implications are. Also establish the processes on the source code side, essentially that we do source code checks before we publish anything to make sure it's all our IP, etc., etc. So there's a number of things. I think if you want to know a little bit more about the details how this works, so we have one of our early who will be presenting this afternoon. He's one of the people who's living that and breathing that every day. So if there's some questions of how this works, I think he would be the best person to have a chat with later on. And then obviously the open source ecosystem. So if you simply decide for yourself, oh, I have a piece of software here, I want to open source that, and you put it on GitHub, not much will happen. Most likely nothing will happen. If you're lucky, somebody will notice and they might start using it. But that's where it's important also to understand the importance of what's already out there. How can I engage with existing communities? How can I be part of those communities? And how does my project fit into one of these communities? And this is, again, for us in the IoT world, we found our home with, so not just IoT, but many more projects as well. We found our home with the Eclipse Foundation. We found a very good match there due to two reasons. On the one hand side, we have this specific IoT focus that we found with the Eclipse IoT working group. And I think this has been a very successful collaboration in the past. But it's also when we see it all the governance that the Eclipse Foundation is doing as well. So they're helping us a lot with fulfilling or making sure that we are clean on anything we publish and that we have done our homework, our due diligence when releasing software as well. So this is, I think, another big piece in finding the right ecosystem and working with the right partners. So just here, a little bit more on this part of open source strategy and also the open source management. I think there are many different factors that you want to take into account. And I think it's also important to understand for us, for example, when it comes to marketing. also. Being part of open source is part of is a value proposition for your customers. I think the fear that if you're a big company like IBM, like Bosch, that you're going out of business tomorrow, I mean, it's not impossible, but chances are relatively low. But nevertheless, if we decide tomorrow to change our business models, that we decide that we increase our prices and you're not happy with it anymore, you do have the possibility either to go out there, use the open source software yourself, or find somebody else who's providing also a service or a product based on that same software, and essentially you have a security on your invest as well. So coming specifically to the IoT, we've already heard the phrase before, nobody can IoT alone. And I think open source software is the start of it. It ends really with building systems, for example, for us at Bosch, when we connect devices, that those devices don't live in a closed world, but that there are APIs that you can connect to those devices and you can interact with those devices and integrate them also in your own solution, if you like. Now you can imagine Bosch is a company 130 years old, and lots of great IP has been developed, and hence the engineers are also proud of what they have developed. And for many of them, it's unthinkable to open up their products to make that also work for others. However, we have a clear message also from our CEO that for the IoT, there has to be an open system. We want to work with partners, whether it's on the software side, whether it's on the hardware side, and we want to create more for the company, for our customers, opening up this IoT ecosystem. Open source is one key pillar of that. Now, if you're looking at the IoT, what we're seeing today is we're seeing a lot of different solutions that have been implemented. So you see a few examples here. And so these are what we often refer to as first generation examples. If I pick out one here, the Indigo, so this is a smart lawnmower, detects where your lawn is most on its own, and you have the possibility to control it via a smartphone app. Why do I call this generation 1 of the IoT? It's essentially what we're seeing here is what we say each solution, each product lives in a silo, right? So for example, if we ask our colleagues, so we've implemented the solution at Bosch Soft Innovations for our colleagues at Power Tools, you will not find APIs yet. So this is really something where we're now working on the second step to actually tear down those silos. But you cannot do this unless you have an element in the middle that helps tie those silos together, that makes them work together. So when I'm referring to our CEO, here he is. We see all these products being connected, but it's also one of the things that we need to understand in the IoT. If we simply build solutions like the one I've just shown, where I have one physical product, one solution, and no interaction with the outside world, I need to find all the value proposition in this world. And I think we observe right now that there's a lot of hesitance from customers to buy connected products. Why is that? It's on the one hand side, they're asking, so where's the added value if I connect this product? In some cases, it's very obvious. Techies like us, they love these type of things, right? If I can check on my lawnmower from my mobile phone, I think there's a nerd effect there as well. However, if you're a regular customer who's not very tech savvy, you're really asking, why should I spend more money on this lawnmower just because it's connected? So what we will see happening at some point in time, and I hope that's actually happening rather sooner than later, that we'll see the APIs for all the products, and we're able to create solutions which provide added value, which also cut across the different domains. That we move into a world where my lawnmower, I think in that case it was integrated with the weather forecast as well, but also when I can see maybe there's, I don't know, construction happening next doors, the big truck is coming, there's dust created, maybe I want my lawnmower to hide in his garage to make sure that it doesn't get too dusty, things like that. This is a little bit, you still wouldn't pay for that, I'm pretty sure, but I think you get the point that if I have this possibility to connect the things across the domains, across these different products, that I can create more. And I think there's some very good examples out there, and so this is happening anyway, but we're looking for these APIs and looking for making all of this happening. So at Bosch, 1 million devices per day, 1 million products per day coming off the assembly line. And what we're really looking into, and what we're also working on within our company, is this generic IoT platform based on IoT-enabled devices, and then the possibility to provide these services. Now, long story, what I'm coming back to, and why I'm talking about this in the first place. All of this platform and this whole strategy is based on open source software. Within this cross-domain platform that we're working on, we think that for us internally, it's important to have our own platform. That's for strategic reasons that we want to keep this. However, we know we want to collaborate with other companies on this platform. We've seen from Benjamin's presentation some of the projects that I'll come back to where we are actively involved, that we are also driving on our side. But this has been a core pillar within Bosch. If we're saying we're doing the IoT, we're doing this using open source software, and we're actively engaging with the open source community there. I mentioned strategic reasons. Bosch has been an independent company owned by a foundation, private company, not publicly listed. So this is one of the very important parts important statements for the company. We had been involved with the Eclipse Foundation for a number of years in different projects. So if you look around the website of the Eclipse Foundation, you'll find a fair number of projects that we're involved with. There was particularly around embedded software development, around the topics of toolchains, also the Eclipse IDE, and then also more recently the Eclipse IoT, where I got into. So you've seen these projects earlier on from Benjamin. I think for us a key part is the Eclipse Hono project, which is the messaging, the communication layer, if you like, of our IoT platform, which then ingests the data, which makes it available to Eclipse Ditto, which we refer to as the digital twin, or the state management of the digital twin. So Eclipse Ditto essentially provides that API layer for every device in normalized form for anybody to use. There's a fine-grained access for the different users, and it directly enables building up these ecosystems with different partners and for third parties. Now, one of the things I was joking to Benjamin when I was looking at the projector here, I see they do the software management based on stickers. So firmware checked August 24. So you can tell it's not connected. It's not connected to Hawkbit yet, because if we had it connected, we don't need to put stickers on the devices. But we can check this on our IoT platform or on our phone, whatever the current state is. Benjamin has mentioned Lishan. One thing, I'm a little bit sad, Benjamin, you didn't mention Vorto. But I think we'll have Early, who will be talking more about Vorto this afternoon. Vorto is one of the projects in Eclipse IoT. I think similar to what we've seen also with the Web of Things, and there's also some relationships there that will ultimately enable this ecosystem or the system of systems to easily integrate devices from different domains to add the semantics to the devices such that the solution can understand, no matter where the data is coming from, what the value range might be, but what this data is and what it can do with that data, and how potentially to interact with the device as well. I think we'll have an interesting presentation on those models because what really the interesting part there is that you can describe a device and then use that description to generate code which uses PAHO, sends the information to Hono and represents it in Ditto, and your application or also third parties will understand what this information is. But before I get too far, I think the second presentation after lunch, you'll have the chance to learn more about that. Yep. And that's bringing me to the end. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions.
So I'm thinking about if I have internet connected devices in my home, and I have them from a variety of vendors, including Bosch, and they're all connected to different platforms. Maybe at some point it would be useful. There are pluses and minuses as to whether connecting them to the same platforms where they can exchange information is a good thing, or whether each individual vendor will have their own platform, which will be a silo unto itself. How do you see this developing over the next, say, decade? That is cooperation with other companies on IoT platforms.
I think a very good question, also a very interesting one, because it really comes down to what do I need on a technical level to realize that integration across different vendors from these platforms. So what I would expect, and I think 10 years, I don't know if 10 years is enough really, but what I would hope for that at some point in time that we'll see something like federation of the IoT platforms, that there would be the possibility to make data from maybe from one vendor available also through the platform of another one, that I can use the single API with the single authentication and authorization. So this is one of the things. Also, one of the statements from our CEO in this case is, it says he wants to be able at one point in time to talk to Apple and says, I give you access to all of my data, and this is what it will cost. So I think this is really also a development, but to be honest, whether we'll see that within the next 10 years, I'm not so sure. But this is something that I could definitely picture happening. But I think there's much more consolidation that will also happening in the IoT platform market as well, and also we'll need to see how this will all play together eventually. There's another question.
Hi, just a quick one. What is the roadmap you have as part of the IOTA, which is part of the blockchain? Now, as you know that we are moving to decentralized technology. So, as part of the innovation, part of the Bosch, do you have any roadmap or towards this transformation to the new technology?
Yeah, I think when you're referring to IOTA specifically, we are also invested in IOTA through our Bosch venture capital branch. We definitely see blockchain technologies and also technologies like IOTA as an important technology coming up for the future. How this will pan out in detail, I think it's still a little bit too early to say, but we've had some also showcases, I think already 1.5 years ago with the odometer reading on the blockchain, for example, to avoid odometer fraud with cars, especially second-hand cars. So this is also one of the topics that we're looking into and invested in as well. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, I'm so sorry if you've covered this and I'm asking this a bit later in the day, but an extension of the question the gentleman was asking there. From a consumer point of view, one of the challenges I face with the Internet of IoT-related products is most products are designed for a particular software level. When I have to when I'm upgrading, I have to upgrade my app as well as the product. Is there any thinking around how IoT can be used to upgrade a product remotely just by software, by keeping the hardware constant, which then means there is less and less of technical garbage lying around?
Yeah, I think also a very good question. And I think there's, as of today, when we're looking at the state of the IoT in general, I think that there's still a lot to be learned. And this is one of the things, the areas where I personally feel that there's still a lot that needs to happen, because I think a lot of companies are not aware yet that when you're going into the IoT, specifically in the industrial sector, that this is not your smartphone that will be replaced in 2 or 3 years' time, but this is hardware that will last for 10, 20 years. And I think there's some awareness around that. I think we have actually some of the projects here as well when it comes to the device lifecycle management that needs to be considered, that the companies are aware of that. And I think especially the companies that have been in this business for a long time. However, I think when we're coming from the consumer side, it's a different story. And I feel your pain, but I think it's also something where the consumer can also play an important role by spending the money or not spending the money on certain projects as well, and asking the vendors as well. So what's your longer term strategy? Because I think there's two aspects typically when it comes to software update from my point of view. The first one is really, are you going to support my hardware in terms of security throughout the life cycle? That's a big one. Something that the normal consumer is not aware of. And the second one is, how are you going to extend the functionality of my device in the future? How will it support future standards maybe? How will it support, provide value still in 4 or 5 years? And we're already seeing that even with the smartphones. It's not really happening, right? And I think this is really where the consumer will play a key role in as well, by being selective of what they're buying and what they're not buying, when it comes to the consumer market as well. And then I think that's the only way to make the companies live up to their responsibility as well. Any other? There's one more.
So on the IoT front, right, the security is one of the major concerns. So how do you see, I mean, I didn't hear anything about the security aspects in any of the presentations. Any thoughts around security? Because these devices are remote, and being remote, you could have anything happening. Any kind of attack that you can think of, an internet attack, right, can be applicable to the IoT world. How do you see that from a Bosch perspective? Because Bosch is very at the core business of sensors and stuff. So, thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. I think it's also a very typical question to come up when we're talking about the IoT is always security. I think first, in general, the security topic, I think there's a lot of companies are not yet aware of what it means to connect a product to the internet. And I've heard this statement, I think it's a couple of years ago. Things have also changed drastically in the last 2 years. But essentially, I've heard this statement that the device makers are now going through the same process that the web application developers went through 15 years ago. And I think this is a very, very true statement. So now you have, I've shown the slide with the 65,000 R&D engineers. They have not been working on web technologies or those who are building software, so they need to be trained as well. And that also takes some time. And I think this is not just for Bosch, this is for any company out there. I think on the other side, now I might be offending some people out of security here, I think the basics of security are not so difficult. When you're hearing typically about the incidents that are happening, it's like things on devices, firewalls were not even set up. Known vulnerability were not patched, and so on and so forth. So I think this is also something that that is coming up, and specifically when it comes to Bosch, for us, the security is one of the top priorities, has been all the time. We have fairly strict requirements when it comes to secure engineering, whether it's on the cloud side or it's on the device side, something that's very serious. I think for us it's also, it's at the end of the day, it comes down to protecting the brand also. And I think Bosch is a brand that's usually associated with high prices, high quality. And so essentially you can understand that the risk for us to forego security is huge. And this is not something we want to do. But I think in general, we've seen improvements throughout the industry, but I think there's still more that needs to happen, really. But I also feel that if somebody hacks into a device, I think we see things like Meili, the botnets that are happening. I mean, this is serious, but the damage that happens to you as a customer is fairly small if it's only this one device where you have one data point. When a breach happens in the back end, it's an entirely different story. And this is also a little bit this, I think, when it comes to this whole security story about understanding the risk and understanding the impact as well that is happening. So it's also not just black and white. There's been a security breach, but to be honest, I was very happy when I got my router from my telco here in Singapore, and I realized I didn't have a default password on the router when the login was not admin, but it was actually a randomly generated one. So this also shows me that even on that side, we're making these improvements. We're making the next step. So. And we will never be perfect as well. Whenever there's software, it will be hacked at some point in time.
So I think this IoT or the blockchain technology which is coming is one of the key thing is the security aspects. So they will be generating some unique key while when there is a talk between the two devices like M2M devices. So that is the one of the revolution of the new technology for which they are having one, and one of the key thing will be for the security aspects.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, with that I think, oh, there's one more question. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
There was an instance recently of Google Home thermostats or Google Nest thermostats not working because the internet platform went down. So what's Bosch's approach to reliability under these circumstances?
This is building on open source. I think there's various levels in engineering that you can take when it comes to reliability. I think on the one hand side, I think we have with the open source projects that we're talking about, and also where we can actually benefit from this collaboration, because it's not just Bosch having that interest in reliable software when it comes to the back end, but all of our partners as well. And So this is, I think, one of the topics. But the other topic is also that devices need to be able to run autonomously as well. And I think this is also key when you're designing such a system, that you can have an added value from any backend cloud-based implementation, but the device also needs to be able to deliver without the connectivity as well.